Welcome to Category Visionaries, the show dedicated to exploring exciting visions for the future from the founders who are on the front lines building it. In each episode, we'll speak with a visionary founder who's building a new category or reimagining an existing one. We'll learn about the problem they solve, how their technology works, and unpack their vision for the future. I'm your host, Brett Stapper, CEO of Frontlines Media. Now let's dive right into today's episode.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Category Visionaries. Today we're speaking with Sloane Barbour III, CEO and founder of Engin, an AI recruiting platform that's raised over $4 million in funding. Sloane, how are you?
Brett, using my full name, I appreciate it. Really landing the credibility early.
You're not in trouble. I feel like normally when someone uses the full name, they're in trouble. Super excited to have you here. I think this is going to be an awesome conversation. Before we jump into everything that you're building, I want to talk a little bit about your background. Now, normally when I have on guests, I say, no one cares about the background. Let's just jump right into what they're building. But I think those stories are very much tied together with what you're doing today as a direct tie into what you've previously been doing in your life. So tell us a bit more about your background and what you were doing before founding the company.
Absolutely. So I come from a background in recruiting and sales, starting in staffing and recruiting agencies in 2005, starting entry level, making 100 dials a day into the main line of corporations to the Chicagoland area. So kind of cut my teeth in what I would consider to be old school sales, perhaps a lost art, and then moved my way up in a single company, saw incredible growth over 10 years, did a few different sort of startups and early stage companies, all in the recruiting and recruiting technology space. And then about 3.5 years ago, co-founded Engin with my co-founder and CTO, Valerie, and our creative director, Jamie.
Amazing. And then what did those early days look like for the company? Let's start with maybe the first, 3 months. What were those first 3 months like?
A lot of excitement. I think when you have a tiger by the tail and you come up with a great idea with a great team of people that are passionate about solving it, it creates a lot of excitement. And I think reality sets in probably in that first 3 to 6 month window when you start to get momentum. We were fortunate to have some partners that helped us launch and fund our first $500,000 friends and family check. And one of those partners was a recruiting firm that we were able to sort of incubate inside of. And the first 3 months were the most exciting day, coming to work and collaborating with the team. And then months 3 to 6, we're like, wow, this is something real. And then beyond that, you're like, we don't do this because it's hard work. We do this because we thought it wouldn't be so hard. That's the old saying that, kind of gets everyone where they're at. And then you become entrenched and then you just focus on solving the problem.
Well, let's talk about the problem that you're solving. So at a high level, how do you articulate that problem?
So the problem is that companies and recruiting firms spend about 80% of their time speaking to and interacting with, candidates who are never going to move forward past an initial application or phone screen in the process. And this doesn't work great for job seekers either. So job seekers on average will apply to 80 to 100 jobs just to get 4 or 5 interviews and actually get, a job they want. And sometimes that number is much higher. And, with the advent of the one-click apply and sort of job listings being ubiquitous on platforms like LinkedIn and Indeed and ZipRecruiter, you end up with incredible noise and not a lot of signal. And I think at this moment in time in 2025, the workforce is evolving so rapidly and the way in which people view, a job and a career has shifted completely. So what this ends up meaning is you have several billion, phone interviews taking place every year, and almost 100% of those don't result in any sort of material next steps. So we believe we can reverse that trend and focus instead on quality instead of quantity, and using AI and AI agents that work closely with both the hiring teams, the recruiters, and the job seekers, we can create a process that is 80% waste and make it 80% success.
Amazing. I love it. What would you say is the state of AI in recruiting right now? Obviously, there's a lot of buzz. We're talking about AI. I think it's impossible to not talk about AI. How do you think about the state of the market?
So there has been historically in HR technology and recruiting technology for staffing firms, traditionally not the most modern software platforms, and nor do the sort of recruiting and sales teams that work inside these staffing organizations rely or trust technology very much. And I think having been in that role for 15 years of my career, I can understand why, because there was a lot of things that overpromised and underdelivered. And I think you see a few platforms that are breakout successes, like LinkedIn and Indeed being sort of the most notable at the top of the funnel. And then you have the ATS ecosystem, which, Workday is probably the most commonly known. And then there's hundreds of other ones And then there's various bolt-on tools that, give you incremental improvement in, say, scheduling or incremental improvement in ranking. And I think the reason why this was always sort of a lot of hype and not a lot of results is because the underlying technology that existed prior to LLMs was really deterministic. So, and that's sort of the opposite of what a job description and a resume are. Job description and a resume are sort of all completely unique. And they really even only capture a very small amount of data on what that company, that team, that job is really all about in one page, and vice versa. One page to determine exactly what an individual worker is all about. It's clearly not enough. So you're dealing with bad data in, and then you're dealing with deterministic software platforms, which historically couldn't really make sense of a lot of that data consistently. So humans ended up having to do all the work. And in my 15 years in recruiting, we started off with the best recruiters doing consistently 2 or 3 or maybe 4 deals a month. And I just checked in with some folks literally at the same firm, and it's almost exactly the same. And I think this, however, LLMs in particular, and this ability to contextualize unstructured data like job descriptions and resumes at scale and for very, very low cost is truly a revolution in how recruiters, job seekers, and hiring managers can take advantage of technology. So, long way of saying, I think I'm very excited being an expert in the space, and I think it started to take note with investors, and particularly some of this sort of tier 1 investors investing in organizations like Micro One, Mercor, Tezzy, and others who are building similar products to Engin.
And what about the market category? So when I say market category, what comes to mind for you?
The market category would be recruiting technology, talent technology, broadly.
And then what's the more specific one? Like if Gartner were to do a market map, where would they place you? Like what would the line item be is maybe a better question.
Yeah, I think it would be, recruitment, marketing, and automation is our kind of category, which is largely defined right now. It's about an $18 billion category, largely defined by money people spend to acquire job seekers into their funnel. So most of this money goes to 3 players: LinkedIn, ZipRecruiter, and Indeed. And then there are a lot of, sort of the adjacent categories like HR or recruiting tech platforms. So these are like ATS systems, scheduling systems, CRMs, matching systems, et cetera. That category there's sort of 2 fingers on the same hand, if you will, and one leads into the other. So we span through both of those. It's about a $30 billion category in total. But what's interesting is, to your point about category creation or category expansion, is when you look at, staffing firms, which are about a $200 billion market here in the US, the vast majority of their costs are in, headcount. And I do think when you look at the category that sort of utilizes the recruitment, marketing, and recruiting technology pieces of the line items is the actual recruiters themselves. And I think being able to actually address recruiter productivity at the headcount level and be able to take, $1 million investment in recruiting teams and turn that into, 3x production. So it's like you're investing $3 million in humans, but you're in fact, investing, maybe 20 or 30% of that in an AI solution. I think it makes the recruiters' jobs more valuable, more secure, more enjoyable. And I think it creates a lot of leverage for a staffing firm in particular that is then going to add that margin to their bottom line.
What about your marketing strategy? If we zoom out, what does the marketing strategy look like?
So marketing for us is predominantly based on sort of B2B thought leadership, across platforms like LinkedIn as, founder-led kind of branding and content. We also have a really robust partner network. So we have a lot of integrations, APIs, and partners that we co-sell with. That's been super helpful for just kind of navigating this AI transition in recruiting and staffing together. And then finally, look, as much as it can be frustrating sometimes, all of the sort of, outbound direct email, SDR type work, is really what we're starting to ramp up. I will say, I was launching outbound campaigns and outreach, 8-10 years ago. And at first it was like a gold mine. And I truly believe that channel has been pretty beat down, and it's certainly not what it once was. So that's when you come back to this inbound created by founder content and people really resonating with someone who actually has deep knowledge of a particular space and isn't just, building a technology point solution, but is building a real holistic business solution.
This show is brought to you by Frontlines Media, a podcast production studio that helps B2B founders launch, manage, and grow their own podcast. Now, if you're a founder, you may be thinking, I don't have time to host a podcast. I've got a company to build. Well, that's exactly what we built our service to do. You show up and host, and we handle literally everything else. To set up a call to discuss launching your own podcast, visit frontlines.io/podcast. Now, back to today's episode.
It's been cool to see this shift of founder-led marketing, founder-led content. I feel like all over my feed, I'm seeing it, and it's very refreshing. When we look at the kind of traditional approach to comms was, put it in a press release, have a paragraph from the CEO, and like that comm style looked identical to the comm style of the CEO of Ford, which if you're a startup, obviously it should be a bit different. So I like this shift of, founder-led marketing, founder-led comms, founder-led sales. Like, who's inspiring you on that? Are there any companies specifically or any founders that come to mind that you see them approaching comms in this way that you think is just really effective at it?
Yeah, I would say Brett Adcock is probably the best in the world from Figure.
Go.
Yeah, he's probably the best founder-led comms guy I've seen, particularly on X. Austin Allred from Gauntlet AI, I think, has a very interesting and somewhat provocative, but I think effective approach to sharing insight and the sort of the real talk on what's happening in AI. But then in my category, Ali Ansari from Micro One has done some great stuff on X, and I found his content really valuable. So I do look at that, and having been someone who historically has used, leveraged LinkedIn for things like one-to-one comms and, messaging, getting out of your comfort zone a little bit is part of what being a founder is all about. And so that was something that I wasn't as familiar with and comfortable with historically, but have started to really just put myself out there. And I must say, like, it does work. And every time I post something that takes me 10 minutes to write up, but maybe almost 20 years to be able to write that thought because of my experience in the space, like, it very clearly resonates with people who are, kind of going through a similar journey to everyone else, which is if you're not an AI company and you're doing, say, recruiting or staffing or running a restaurant or running a financial firm or whatever, it's very overwhelming. So to be able to just provide value and insight into what this really means and break it down in a way that people understand and how they can implement small pieces into their business that have real value, I think, people respond to that and they're down to have a meeting. And as we know, meetings is what it's all about in sales.
Can you talk to us a bit more about those early days of sales? I know in the pre-interview we were talking, and this was before SDRs even existed. So what was your first sales role and first sales experience like?
My very first sales role, I got to the office. It was a mass interview, like where they put a bunch of kids in a conference room and like boiler room style, basically tell you that you're gonna make $100 a day, and half the people leave, and then they're like, people who are still here, you can start on Monday. So that was like, just the interview was like, all right. Then I got to this office in Chicago. There was, 30 people, all super high energy, and sat down, and a woman named Ann put a stack of resumes on my desk and gave me a script and said, read this and plug in this guy's name. And I did it. And she said, do it again. And I did it. She's like, good enough, call. And I mean, that was it. And then I got on the phone and started calling, I guess resumes that they had stored away from 6 months, a year and a half ago, recruiting candidates, recruit 20 candidates. You get on the phone with customers. Same thing, get a shoebox full of old business cards and leads, get the Cranes journal out and be the first one in the office so you can get the Cranes for that week. So you could source the, best banks and tech companies that are, in the Chicagoland area, and look at the local papers and see who's posting jobs and call them up and pitch a candidate. Tell them who you got. Tell them that, you're working with a great Java developer at the time, COBOL developer, that they need. Leverage that product kind of hook, just like, you see in modern advertising, something that people want, put that right in the front display and get them to engage in a conversation with you. And I didn't have a computer on my desk for almost 2 years. And so it was just nothing but me, the phone, and a legal pad, and all of these, old leads. So you learn a lot about, I think, yourself doing that in a sales role. And then you also realize that absolutely anything is possible, because the product we were selling was really nothing. I mean, it was a person, of course, at the end of the day that they ended up hiring, but you didn't have to have even an office. I could have just had a phone and a phone book, and you could have started a recruiting business. And a lot of people did. And so I just felt like it taught me early on that, hey, if I can do, a phone and the stack of resumes, and I can convince people to talk to me, and then I can convince them to, engage with me and sign a contract, and then convince them to pay me $30,000, $40,000 to hire a Java developer in Schaumburg, Illinois. I'm like, wow, that's, you're 22 years old. You can do pretty much anything. And that was inspirational. And yeah, I moved up through that company over 10 years into eventually, managing director role, and had 60 people kind of coming up through that same organizational structure. And it's still effective today. I mean, learning that skill set builds a lot of character, and it teaches a lot of valuable lessons that I think stick with you in your career.
What's that like managing 60 plus salespeople? That must have just been insane.
It was so fun. And it was also like incredibly high stress. And like there was a few like legitimate breakdowns that I had just dealing with the constant motion. But at the time, I had 11 sales teams, each with, 5 people typically on them, 2 or 3 like marketing and support and sourcing people. And pretty much everyone, 90% of the team is just pure sales and recruiting, just absolute maniacal little hustlers, And so you get just a bunch of these personalities in a room. This is when we were all going to the office back in the before times. And it was incredibly fun. It was energizing. And I think it also, again, opens your eyes that like, if you give people an opportunity and you plug them into something that has a semblance of structure and ROI that's very kind of like immediately measurable on an almost hourly basis, you make a call, you have a good conversation, you get a high five. Like that's all you got to do. Just have 20 of those good conversations every day, make money in those calls and things will come. And then you see them get a week down the road and they have a customer, and then another 2 weeks down the road and they get their first revenue. And then another, 2 months down the road and they get, for their first, promotion. And many of the people who worked in that organization, 18 to 24 months were, making 6 figures and running their own teams. It was truly a rocket ship type growth. And at the same time, Brett, there was turnover, there was a lot of stress, kind of intentionally placed on the sales teams to perform. And sometimes that good stress, which I would, kind of place on them as the leader of the offices, turned into, unproductive stress. And I think one of the things I learned is as a great sales leader, VP, CRO, you have to beat the drum and keep the tempo high, but you also have to give people ability to win, right? They have to feel like they can win, even if they feel like they almost broke themselves doing it. As long as they get across the line and they feel that win, you can sustain that. If you're putting people up against the wall and there's no way for them to win, that very quickly turns into a bad, stressful work culture. And I had that happen a few times, but luckily we were able to spot it and turn it around.
And I know you're just now beginning to hire an SDR. How are you thinking about filling that role? I've struggled with that. I've probably hired, 3 or 4 SDRs over the years, and I've not been able to make it work. I always just end up going back to founder-led sales. And I know a lot of other founders who are in a similar spot. How are you thinking about hiring for this role?
Well, I've been doing founder-led sales for 3 years and it's been successful, and I'll continue to do it. And it'll be our primary way to hit the number will be based on what I can control, at least for the next, 12 months as we're building this, kind of sales and marketing engine from the ground up. Because the founder-led sales, it scales if you're doing very large deals and you can pull them in and have a team to help onboard and close. But it obviously doesn't scale if you're trying to do like a ton of volume. And, we're expanding into, both the enterprise and also starting to see some really good mid-market pickup where we can use some more just volume of meetings. And that becomes the limiting factor at a certain point. And that's really kind of where our limiting factor is. So having hired and trained a lot of entry-level salespeople and SDRs in my day, I find that the number one most important thing is transparency of expectations. And I think this starts in the interview process. And I think if you're incredibly transparent with the expectations, and then you validate that not only they understand it, but they've had experience achieving sort of those same types of expectations, a lot of which is based off very simply effort. There's almost no other input, like intellectual levels. Like you have to obviously be smart enough, but I think some people are a little too smart and try to get too smart with it and don't just do the work. But it is a almost exactly one-to-one job. You put in more effort, you make more calls, you send more emails, you will get more results. And so you have to validate that they have that kind of mindset. And then you have to have visibility into their performance on a daily basis. So how many meetings did we book? How many calls did we make? How many emails did we send? And you have to set that up from day 0. And it's not because you want to run a surveillance state. Like we're a mostly remote company. We do in-persons in New York City, but my team's mostly in the Northeast. But, with an SDR, with any sales team, like you have to know exactly what's going on. And the reason you need to know is because that person's income and ultimately career and job depend on that. And the ball don't lie. So if they do the work and nothing's happening, then you can start to triage anything else further down the funnel around like your ICP or your messaging or, your lists, your data, which of course will always have to evolve. But if you don't have that one input at the person individual level and at the sort of foundational structure level of visibility, transparency, and accountability, then it usually doesn't go anywhere. But I would say hiring and developing an SDR for maybe not the founder, but one of the co-founders needs to be a core skill. Because if you can't do that over time, you can't really run any sort of a large scale sales organization. And therefore you can't hit $100+ billion in revenue. It would just become impossible. So it is something that needs to get done, and it probably needs to get done, in between the sort of middle of the seed and the Series A.
This show is brought to you by the Global Talent Co., a marketing leader's best friend in these times of budget cuts and efficient growth. We help marketing leaders find, hire, vet, and manage amazing marketing talent for 50 to 70% less than their US and European counterparts. To book a free consultation, visit globaltalent.co.
What about fundraising? So as I mentioned there in the intro, over 4 million raised to date. What have you learned about fundraising throughout this journey?
I've learned that it is a lot of work. It's a lot of work to raise money, and it's not something that is a part-time job. So when you're a founder, luckily I have an incredible team and was able to dedicate the time necessary to raising money when I was raising money. I've also had incredibly supportive investors who have not only helped, bring in other investors, but continue to participate in our funding rounds. So, I think who you end up taking money from and bringing around the table is really, really important. But I also learned that it's all kind of made up. And what I mean by that is there's a process to sales, there's a process to engineering, there's a process to product management. Everything in life and in nature can have an optimal process. And fundraising can also have an optimal process. But the process is not really that important. At the end of the day, what's important is, one, you have a incredibly performant business, especially when you start to get past the seed stage where you need to show real numbers and traction. And so until you do that and get to that point, fundraising is probably not going to be fruitful. And then two, you have to have a narrative that is easy to understand and that can be explained in probably 7 seconds, which I think a lot of my struggle was early on when we were kind of really figuring out exactly what our narrative and our lane and our positioning was, which is a natural part of the process, but it does burn cycles. And if you're burning them with investors that are potentially going to invest in your round, it can actually be strategically damaging. So you want to be really ready when you do that. And then finally, the vast majority of investors will waste your time, but it's not because, they're bad people or they're not interested. It's almost always because you're just not aligned on the thesis. And if you're talking to people more than a call where the thesis is off by more than 20%, meaning you're a seed, they're Series A, I almost, it's nice to know that person, but I almost would rather just end the call 15 minutes, keep them in the phone book for, 18 months down the line instead of trying to, explore how they could make an exception because they're really excited about this deal. I find those exceptions very, very rarely happen, if at all. So I think you learn just like you do in sales, what's your ICP? How do you qualify them? And then how in a sort of 5-minute introductory call that you get maybe 2 minutes of that to really make an impact, can you compel them that this is something they want to really pay attention to?
When you reflect on the go-to-market journey, what do you think's been the most important and critical decision that you've made? And take us back, how did you make that decision?
So I think on the go-to-market journey, the most critical decision we made was about 2 years ago, which was we were positioning ourselves squarely in what I would call the ATS category, applicant tracking system category, which is a knife fight. There's a lot of those businesses, and I believe it's a commodity product. And we made the decision to position ourselves a little further up the funnel as a recruitment, marketing, and automation solution. And we discovered that a lot of the pain point, especially with high volume hiring, was not that they didn't have a system of record to store these applicants in, or, they could manage some interviews, or maybe it helped them a little bit with scheduling. These were incremental gains. Their problem was they were not talking to good people. They were not talking to relevant people. They were not talking to people quick enough. They were not even really connecting with the signal in all the noise. And the organic job seeker traffic they were getting from, say, Indeed, which basically just floods the zone, especially with these one-click applies and Indeed applies. Well, you can get a lot of quantity unless you have a full-time recruiter or a very good system to do that. You generally can't find that quality. And by the time you do, in a high volume role or an hourly role, it might be too late. You have 24 hours to get in touch with these people and get them into the process. So we moved up the funnel and we were able to capture a lot more value. These companies we were working with were spending a lot more dollars in this particular area, probably about 3 to 1 compared to what they were spending on the HR tech. And there were some, drawbacks, which is that it was a little bit different of a type of revenue. But the way we've been able to build our product is kind of revolutionary in that a lot of the AI inside of our targeting, our matching, our proprietary fit score, and our AI screening agents, which we use both sort of text and voice to kind of separate the signal from the noise. We're able to sit on top of all these ATS systems, integrate with them, and actually create probably 3 times as much value as we would have been able to create by making like a quote unquote better mousetrap in the ATS category.
Final question for you. Let's zoom out 3 to 5 years into the future. What's the big picture vision here?
So I think that the labor market in the US and globally is going to undergo the most significant and jarring transformation in all of the history of mankind. And I think it's going to be incredibly scary for workers, for employers, and for the staffing and recruiting firms who service these markets and who are responsible for a lion's share of the recruiting, especially in high volume roles, is outsourced to, staffing, recruiting, and RPO firms. And as AI agents, digital labor start to materialize, as AI powered robots start to materialize, you're going to see people shift up into higher value, higher leverage roles. And that's going to require an evolution of skill set and an evolution of what they think and understand is possible in terms of their career. And I think being able to shepherd the workforce and the employers and recruiters through this process is one of the most, I think, compelling and important missions. So my view in 3 to 5 years is that Engin will have helped to not only get, millions of people jobs that they love, but actually create those jobs along the way by helping people understand what AI actually enables you to do. Because that job that is going to exist 3 to 5 years from now, 80 to 85% of them don't exist today. And that transition is going to be rapid, and it's going to come in a fast pace, and it's going to require that we are very thoughtful about how we address this, and with society and with the stakeholders, to actually make sure that people can come out on top. Because I think AI can do a lot to increase human productivity and increase human happiness, but it also is not a completely benign technology, and it needs to be treated in such a way that we understand this is an incredibly powerful force, and we want to make sure that it's used for good, and that ultimately humans can benefit from it by not necessarily like completely transforming what they do, but spending more time doing the things they love, which is the human part of the job. And every job has an element to it that is uniquely human. And I think if we can spend more time on those uniquely human things, like being able to meet new people like we just did today and have a great conversation, and we have AIs running around behind us doing all the busy work that we don't want to do, that piles up on our to-do list, I actually think that's a pretty good world to live in, Brett.
Amazing. I love it. I love this conversation. This has been a blast. I've learned a ton. I know the audience is going to learn a ton as well. Where should folks go if they want to follow along and keep up with you?
Yeah, I'm on X at NYC Sloane, and I'm on LinkedIn at Sloane Barbour, Sloane, or you can just email me, sloane@engin.co.
I'll have to give you credit. You have the coolest name out of like probably 1,000 interviews so far. So I don't know what people are going to come up with, but they're going to try pretty hard to beat your name.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, Brett. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thank you.
This episode of Category Visionaries is brought to you by Frontlines Media, Silicon Valley's leading podcast production studio. If you're a B2B founder looking for help launching and growing your own podcast, visit frontlines.io/podcast. And for the latest episode, search for Category Visionaries on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.